it's actually slightly more nerve-wracking than probably most of the presentations that I've done. So I do work for Blatchford's. We're one of 4 kind of big companies who operate in the UK. So Blatchford provides a clinical service. So one of the clinics is in Nottingham, as Kat said. Our head office is in Basingstoke, which, if anyone knows, it just has quite a few roundabouts, and nothing too dramatic other than the Blatchford Centre, which is the excitement of Basingstoke. I live in London, but I'm from Glasgow, so hopefully you'll understand the accent. I have just been home for the first time in quite a wee while, so normally when I go home, my accent gets a bit stronger. So apologies if I'm sounding too Scottish. Also feeling slightly depressed about the football yesterday. I really thought this was Scotland's chance to qualify, but we didn't. So bear with me if I seem a bit miserable. But today I just wanted to talk to you. My area of expertise is more about training and education. So my responsibilities are to train other prosthetists on the products that Blatchford will manufacture. Now, today I'm going to try to keep it general. I hope that it suits everybody. It was hard to kind of prepare knowing who was going to be on the presentation, but I do less time in clinic, more time doing training and education. So to start with, I just wanted to kind of say, well, who is a prosthetist? Obviously, those of you who've had meningitis and who've gone through it, or have family members who've gone through it, will hopefully know what a prosthetist is, who they are, and what they'll do for you. But I just want to touch on that, then talk about, for me, the main issue, particularly with meningitis as well, is to do with residual limb health. So we'll talk about that, then go on to some prosthetic components that are available, very briefly talking about some of the new technology, and then just a couple of success stories, and the questions we'll leave till the very end of the session, so we won't do them after my bit. So who's a prosthetist? So somebody like me. So we'll see you. So anyone who's had meningitis, has had an amputation. It could be quite a while post amputation. So Mike was talking that Mike said that he was in a coma for 10 weeks. So there's quite a long period of time, sometimes, from contracting the virus, contracting meningitis, if it's bacterial meningitis, to then actually being ready to be seen by a prosthetist. Sometimes, so one of my colleagues who used to work in Nottingham, he's actually been called upon at times to be in the operating theatre at the point of people having their amputation, just to advise on, particularly with children, just to advise on what the level of amputation should be. Obviously, that it's not very easy to do that. Sometimes it's very much about the tissue viability, as Virgo said, and there aren't many options. However, where there is an option, then sometimes prosthetists will be invited to work with the consultants just to give advice. And really, therefore, after that, we're responsible for the rehab going forward, so for the rest of your lives. And some of that will be, again, as Virgo said, he knows some of his patients very well. I know some of my patients very well, unless we move. So unless a patient leaves the centre that the prosthetist works at, or vice versa, we do tend to build up quite a relationship with the people that we see, and we then get to know their family and sometimes their grandkids. So it's a really privileged position to be in. We do see people who've been through a lot of trauma, but usually at the point where we'll start to provide the prosthetic care, things are in a healthier position. So it's the life-threatening stage has passed, and we can, together with the physios and with the family, we can start to work on the rehab going forward. So for anyone who doesn't know, or who maybe has a child who's who's just recently had meningitis and you're starting to think about prosthetic care, then we talk about a socket. So the socket is the part that goes around the residual limb. So the residual limb is the part that's remaining. Sometimes people call it a stump, or they have another name for it. And one of my patients called it Bob. I don't know why. He didn't really know why, but he just decided that that was what he was going to call the part that was left. So we'll make a socket to go over the residual limb, and then depending on the level, there'll be a prosthetic knee joint, or a foot. There'll always be a foot, and there'll be the parts to connect them. So you can see here we've got the shin tube, we've got the knee here. In very few cases, I've never seen anybody, but with meningitis, it could be that it goes above the knee level, so it starts to go through the hip joint. Personally, I've not seen that. That would be a very severe case. Usually it's below the knee, through the knee, or above the knee, but we'll have these components. And really our job is to try to make life comfortable, so make the socket as comfortable as possible, provide the necessary components to suit the activity, and just work with you going forwards. Not every amputee will want to do the same things, so it's wrong to assume that everybody wants to run, but most people, if they're able, will at least want to be able to walk for particular activities if they can't do it all day, every day. So we work with the physios, we work with the amputees, we work with the families, and then in places like Bristol, or where there's an acute trust and there's the surgical team as well, then we'll also work with the surgeons. So just wanted to talk about, Fergal set me up really nicely, which I'm very appreciative of. So talking about residual limb health, so this is the key part, because ultimately if we can't have a comfortable socket, it really does not matter what the rest of the technology is. So how high tech the foot might be, or the knee, or if there's a super duper hand, it doesn't matter what the technology is if we can't get the socket to be comfortable. And the trouble that we have with a condition like meningitis is it's very much a trauma case. So sometimes if amputees have had vascular problems and it's been a decline, then the surgeons can kind of preempt when the surgery might be. And for all intents and purposes, the actual surgery is much more straightforward compared to how you might find in meningitis, or similar to like a road traffic accident, where we don't have the luxury of being able to say, right, let's cut exactly here. So what we tend to have is a lot of scar tissue. So the skin condition I've listed them as three possible problems. So one is the scar tissue. You can see on the bottom picture here, this is the scar that's there from the amputation, but we also have some extra skin issues, which aren't strictly from the amputation surgery. Then on the pictures on the right, we've got healed scar tissue, but with meningitis, we'll typically have quite a lot of what we call skin grafting. So where we don't have lots of healthy tissue cover the cut end of the bone, but then we need to take skin and other tissue from other parts of the body and potentially transfer them over to help give good skin coverage over the bone. So we're left with lots of scarring. We also potentially have some funny shapes. So the ideal shape isn't necessarily what we're presented with. And then the other issue to do with the skin and to do with the residual limb health is sweating. So those are the three main problems that if you are an amputee, you may have experienced already. You might start to experience. I don't think summer's quite come to the UK yet, But as the temperature gets warmer, usually people start to find more problems with sweating. And these are the key challenges for a prosthetist. So we need to get the socket to be comfortable, and therefore sometimes we have quite a few obstacles in the way. So I just wanted to touch on some solutions now. Full disclosure, obviously this is a branded, Blatchford branded slide. There are lots and lots of liners on the market. There is not one liner or one solution, one foot or one knee that suits everybody. So do trust your prosthetist, because they don't have, some of them might work for the companies that manufacture components, but ultimately we're all here to get the best solution to suit the individual. So do trust their choice, but if it's not working for you, also know that there are lots of options available. These ones have got the Blatchford branding, but there are lots of other companies that manufacture liners. So the key thing with scarring is fundamentally what we want to have is a material that can go over the skin to stop what we call shear forces. So if you imagine you have your hands together and you have one pushing backwards and forwards against the other one, that's what we would consider to be shear forces. So you might you may have in the past had blisters on your feet, blisters in other parts of your body. That's all part of shear forces. So we want to stop that. And the problem that we have is when you have a residual limb that sits within a socket, we try to make it a very good fit. We try to make it comfortable. But the reality is the residual limb acts a bit like another joint. So there is movement at the joint. And we want to try and reduce the movement as much as possible. But where we can't stop the movement, we want to then minimize these shear forces that you get, because that's what causes rubs on the skin. And that's then what can cause blistering, bleeding, and ultimately time off the prosthetic limb while the skin heals, which then means there's time where if it's a child, then they maybe can't go to school quite in the same way, can't do sports, it's more painful to walk. So one of the things that we can do is have a liner, and there's lots of different materials as well. Some materials are better than others, particularly for these shear forces. So the basic principle, just to have one little bit of science in, is we want to try and reduce this coefficient of friction as much as possible to reduce the shear forces. So that will be one thing that prosthetists will do, and the reality will probably be that at some point you'll get moved on to a liner to try and make the residual limb more comfortable within the socket. The next thing, again, thank you to Fergal for setting me up, is the shape can be a problem. And Fergal talked about bony prominences and whether or not it's to do with bone spurs. So one thing that we sort of not expect all the time, but that can happen, is when there's been an amputation through a long bone, so through the humerus or through the femur, for example, then the bone can, especially and more so in children than adults, that the bone can actually grow faster than the soft tissue around it grows. And then so we can sometimes have these things called bone spurs. So it's basically bony growth that just becomes a pointy end that you saw in some of the pictures and some of the x-rays from the previous presentation. And the problem with that is we then have an area of the limb that then is not tolerant to pressure, but has higher pressures due to the shape of the limb. So if you imagine, if you've got a bony prominence, like anytime you knock your elbow bone or your funny bone, I never understood why they called it the funny bone, because I never laugh when I hit it, but that's an area that can be an area of high pressure, and it's the same in the residual limb. So we want to try and protect those areas as much as possible, and therefore reduce the force at those peak, reduce the peak force at those pressure points. And liners, again, is another way that we can do that. It's probably one of the more effective ways that we can do that. And some liners of a different material, so a gel liner works really well because the gel flows around an area of high pressure, and therefore it can reduce the forces better compared to some of the other materials. So that's another positive to do with liners. So if there are issues of skin grafting, if there are areas where we have bony prominences that are painful, then liners are a good way to try and minimize the problems that we have. However, liners also contribute to the residual limb heating up. So sweat is a issue for anybody, regardless of whether you're an amputee or not. And the obvious way that our body tries to cool down is by emitting heat to the surface, so to the skin. For an amputee, and as Mike was saying, he's a quad amputee, so he has less skin coverage to kind of release the heat compared to if Mike had a twin right now who was a non-amputee. So we know that amputees use more energy to walk because they're amputees. We've lost parts of the anatomy. So they use more energy for walking, and they have less area to try and get rid of the heat, and therefore they're more likely to sweat compared to how much they would have sweated as a non-amputee. Obviously, different people have different tolerances to heat. As I said, I'm from Scotland, so I would fry if I went to some parts of America. Some of you Southerners would probably quite like that, but we all have our tolerances to heat. But one of the issues to do with amputees is when they're sweating, that means effectively a wet residual limb is an unhappy residual limb. And again, when we have liners, so that as much as they are very good for cushioning the residual limb and the tissue, they also then work as incubators. So where we have the reality of the residual limb will heat up more than the intact side, with a liner, this makes it even worse. So although I'm saying liners are great for certain things, there are negatives to having liners. But again, the companies have been working on solutions for this, and there are a few different liners on the market from different companies that all work in a similar way to either try to cool the residual limb down. So they have the material has a cooling effect, and therefore it's less likely to heat up and then sweat. Or the liners will allow the sweating, so it doesn't have any effect on heat reduction. But what they do is that when there is sweat, they'll have they've got holes in them. I don't know if you can see in the picture here, you can see the holes in this liner, that they then allow a space for the sweat to get pushed out from the inside of the residual limb to the outside of the liner, and therefore that keeps the skin dry, and therefore it's happier. So we talked about the shear forces earlier. If there's movement of the skin within the socket or within a liner, then that can increase the shear forces. We know that sweat means that there's generally more movement, and therefore the shear forces are higher. So any way that we can to reduce the likelihood of sweating or cool down the temperature is a positive effect. And there are products on the market for this. So if you do have an issue with sweating, then it's worth definitely speaking to your prosthetist. The caveat to that is most of these are only really available for below the knee amputees. So we haven't quite got the solutions for above the knee amputees or for upper limb amputees. But again, the upper body is probably less likely to heat up compared to the lower limb. So just going on to some of the more video, so put it up for 5 seconds. So again, it's very Blatchford marketed video. I apologise for that. But really what I was trying to show is that actually, especially with children, so if any of you are parents of young children who've just contracted meningitis, or maybe it was a few years ago, you'll know, yeah, you'll know the problems that they have experienced. But if any of you who are parents non-stop, or you know, aunts or uncles, you know that kids don't really stop moving. There's very little that will actually make them stop being active. And what's easier when it's children is they have less memory effect on what life was like before the amputation. And kids just have this innate ability to just crack on. They don't think about the difficulties. They don't have the what if monologue that I quite often have going through my head. Well, what if this happens, and what if that happens? Kids are extremely robust. So thinking from a child contracting meningitis, really, the advice I would give is if they're very young, so if it happens when they're a baby or a toddler, like a, you know, two years old, 3 years old, then just let them do what they need to do in the modified way. So they'll still be able to crawl around, they'll still be able to move. And at that point, we really don't want to limit them by giving them prosthetic components. Some of the components are quite heavy, and actually they'll kind of slow the children down more. So there will come a natural point where I think as parents or as family members or other healthcare professionals, or actually the child themselves, will start to realise that actually they can't quite do the things that they want to do the way that they did that when they were younger. So really, when it comes to prosthetic components, it does depend on the activity. Izzy on my left, so I presume it's your left as well, in the wheelchair on the left. So this was, I'll tell you more about her a wee bit later on, but she's a quad amputee as well. So she's bilateral, so that means both sides through the knee, on the lower limbs, and then transradial, so through so she's got both her elbows, but she doesn't have her wrists, again on both sides for her upper limb. And I think she does use the device that's in this in the picture for eating. So it's a very simple sort of, it's an arm with a glove, and she can hold it. So that one is a myoelectric hand, but that particular device, she just found it was too heavy, it was too awkward, and she kind of learned just to eat without any prosthetic devices at all, because she found it easier. She got more feedback as to where the fork was relative to her mouth. So although she can use a prosthetic arm to feed herself, she just finds it easier not to. And that's what the reality is likely to be. But what we're here to do is to just try and figure out what we can use, whether we can use a simple strap that straps around the wrist and then has a slot for a fork to slot into, or a pencil, for example, for school activities that then can be used for feeding or writing. But really just to work with, in this case, with Izzy, so it was my colleague who worked with her, that he just kind of figured out, well, does this work? She kind of said, no, I don't like it. And then we tried something else. And she learned just by trial and error as to what was best for her. Going forward, if we think about the lower limb, so this is where there's been amputations through the legs. Again, there are lots of components on the market. One of them that's done that really has helped, probably from age sort of 5, maybe up to 15-ish, are these mini blade XTs. So they allow the kids, and Izzy herself, she has a YouTube page, which I've got the link to on the next slide, I think, you can have a look at. But she really benefited from having these blades because, again, children don't have, they're not like me where I say, oh, I'm at work and then now I'm going to go and play tennis, and then when I finish tennis I'm going to go to the bar, and I might need different components to do different things if I was an amputee. Kids just go from walking to running to playing to sitting, playing video games, watching TV, back outside to playing football. They just get on with the activities. So Izzy personally found that these feet really helped her because she was able to do all these different activities without having any restrictions. And then I don't know if you can see, hopefully you can see if you change the view, but on the top right, we've got a kid, I have no idea who it is, so took it from the internet, who has a device for cycling. So probably the most common things are for upper limb are something to help maybe with feeding. So it can be a simple device, as I was talking about. Most kids that we see in clinic will cycle. They'll want to cycle, or they'll want to learn how to cycle. It's for a lot of families, cycling is just one of those things that you do as a family, or kids might cycle to school. So again, we'll make something specific just to attach onto the bicycle, because it's easier to have something that's specifically made for a bike rather than have an arm that's used throughout the day and then also used for cycling. It just doesn't work as well. So usually the prosthetist will start to make suggestions, or as parents or anyone who's an amputee yourselves and you want to start cycling again, then there are devices that we can use. There's some that we purchase, so some end parts that we can purchase, or there's lots that we just make up in the workshop. And it is a bit of trial and error, trying to get the angles correct, getting the length right, making sure that that you have stability while you're on the bike. But yeah, cycling is probably the biggest one that, again, focusing on children, and you're obviously not, none of you are children, but focusing on kids, cycling is the one that is the most popular, and probably everyone needs a terminal device for that, for the upper limbs. Any sports at school, just touching on football, most of these devices you saw in the video, Cody is able to play football, and then you saw in Fergal's video, Marshall with a different type of blade, so he's able to kick a football about. So there isn't anything specific for football or specific for other activities. It's really just figuring out, well, can somebody do the activity with the technology that they have? If the answer is yes, then that's great. Then we think about, well, can we make it better, or can we make it more comfortable with more appropriate technology? But not everybody needs to have running blades, for example, to be able to run. And kids, again, are a great example of that, because they will just run on their very basic leg, because that they just run, and that's just what they do. The other things like computer games or musical instruments, again, these are things that it's very much, if that becomes a hobby for somebody, then come, go and talk to your prosthetist, and we can try and get something for that. I don't know if I've got time. I've prattled on a bit too much.
Sorry, just to say, we'll have to, Ewan will need a break in about 2 minutes time.
Okay.
We scheduled it for 7 o'clock, just because it's quite tiring for him to do.
Okay, I'll finish in 2 minutes.
No, absolutely, you don't have to rush. I'm just letting you know, that's all.
Okay, cool. The other thing, more for adults, where we think about being able to cope with heavier components, the advances over the last sort of 10 years have been focusing on hydraulic ankles. So having an ankle that moves, which makes it easy, as you can see in the videos, for walking up and down slopes. It's also much more natural. And then we also have microprocessor knees. So it might be that yeah, from probably the age of sort of 17, 18 and up, and certainly adults, There are microprocessor knees available for anyone who's had an amputation above the knee, but certainly hydraulic ankles, there's lots of evidence to support the use of them in reducing pressure and just making obstacles much easier to navigate. And then not everyone's an athlete, so Johnny Peacock obviously is a gold medalist, Paralympic gold medalist, strictly dancer. He got meningitis at the age of 5. Not everyone is a world class athlete, and Izzy, who you saw earlier, just gets on with life. So you should have a look at her YouTube channel. Some of it's about how to put makeup on, which I think, you know, she's for her, she does her makeup much better than I do mine. I think I might get her to do my hair and makeup the next time I have an engagement. But she just gets on with her life because that's all she knows how to do. So again, a bit like Fergal, it's not all doom and gloom. I think at the point of coming through the trauma, coming through contracting meningitis, there's still plenty of hope. And everyone that I have seen over the years who's had meningitis, they all live extremely full lives, and they don't, there isn't really anything that they would say they can't do that they're particularly desperate to do. So it's a very positive position for me to be in. It's not necessarily like that going through at the very beginning, but yeah, I guess that's all. That's what I'll finish with. Labels are for clothes.